Hey, gang. We're going to talk a bit today about community and where that fits into our uh, approach to mental health and mental resiliency. So, last week we talked a bit, or I talked a bit about learning to deal with the fact and accept the fact that we are not, in fact, in control of all of our outcomes. In fact, we are not exclusively in control, arguably, of any of our outcomes because there are always outside influences which are trying to impose themselves upon us, or maybe not even trying, but simply doing so. And in response to that, I got one comment from Luca Zacharias in which he basically articulated that the self help books, which I had talked about, were trying to supplant the authority of community to some extent, being our advisors and giving us results based mechanisms to try and deal with our problems ourselves alone. And that if we had community, that community was a far better place for us to be able to share the burden of the things that we cannot control. And so, in response to that, I want to take a quick look at that and to see where community fits and what community really needs to be in order to accomplish those things. I say that because we can say the community is beneficial to mental health. And scientifically, you can definitely demonstrate that that's true, that people who are involved in community intimately do seem to have, if you take a broad demographic approach to it, a better outcome in regards to their mental health. But that's a very broad term, community. So we need to, for a second, consider that there is a big difference between the types of mechanisms for coping that you're going to get out of a baseball team, which is a type of community, right? Versus a church, versus the Hells Angels. So I'm going to go ahead and just say that, well, all three of those are a form of community, right? Some are of greater value than others in what they're going to provide you to overcome the things you can't control. And as I very briefly articulated in my response to Lucas, that, the sports team, I suppose you may end up developing the kinds of intimate relationships where you find good mentors to kind of guide you through these difficult problems in life, but that's entirely incidental to just being involved with other human beings. The only really sports specific skills you're going to get are, you know, let's play ball and work out our frustrations physically, and of course that's not irrelevant either. I mean, you can certainly readily find studies that show that physical activity is directly linked to better mental health outcomes. So great. But that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about what effect does community have, not what effect physical activity has. Um, so, okay, so you get your sports team, and that drives you to, forget about it and just go do hard work, and you'll feel good, unless you have that, old sage mentor or whatever that you develop the relationship with. And then you've got the church, and the church is its own thing, and it has, its own kind of book for coping with these things and teaching you how to respond to these things. And it's very much about, as we talked about last time, a degree of fatalism, which is acknowledging that God is sovereign over these things and trusting Him and just kind of letting go. Which in and of itself is not a simple thing to do. And I'll, in another video soon, be talking about materialism, science, and religion, and do these things conflict with one another. But yeah, so church is going to try and give you that fatalistic outlook that lets you surrender to God and trust Him for your outcomes and just kind of move forward. The Hells Angels is, if anything, probably going to commiserate with you on your victim status, the fact that you can't control things, but it's going to encourage you to be angry with that and to rise above it through defying the established order and to take control of the things you can't control by surrendering to something that is not God, but something like selfish criminal behavior. And they will demand certain very selfish things of you, such as theft or murder, or selling drugs to minors and all, well, anyone, frankly, and that will be their expectation. If you want to get patched, it's not a simple process, right? You have to make some pretty significant sacrifices. One might argue to Satan if you want to get into the Hell's Angels. So there's a huge difference here, and we have to respect that. It may not be culturally popular to say this, but we love our ideas of non-discrimination and tolerance. But there's a very big difference between tolerating that which you disagree with and refusing to acknowledge that you disagree with it, okay? So let's just establish that. And now I'm going to say the controversial thing, which is not all cultures are equal. So not all communities will be positive. And as I can talk to my experiences in Haiti, with voodoo culture ultimately is about, and I'm not I'm not fabricating things here. You can follow this and look this up. There's actually a great documentary on this by I can't remember the guy's name, Ezra something or other. He did a whole thing on different religions around the world. But the whole process in voodoo is essentially to try and give yourself over to spiritual possession through the use of drugs and alcohol, and then to be consumed by this spirit guiding you in what you're going to do. So it's a surrender of all self and a desire to be possessed by Loa, or frankly, having been there and looked around, what they explicitly usually call demons, and so they're looking to be possessed by demons intentionally. Well, that's had some pretty significant effects in that culture. And if you want to look at the culture and its output, it's not good, right? It's not been good. And you can say, well, there's socioeconomic reasons for that, and so on and so forth. Yeah, but there's no impetus there for selfless acts. There's nothing in that culture that encourages growth or personal advancement. There's nothing in that culture that restrains violence, and therefore it is a country of anarchy and violence. And there are many who don't observe that culture in the country, and yet they're completely subjugated by those that do, because there's no control. All cultures are simply not equal. It's just not true. Like, in terms of the outcomes of culture, there's going to be different impacts depending on what culture you follow. And that's true within Christian churches as well, okay? So I'm obviously coming at this from the position of a pastor, and I can't even sit here and say that if you should belong to a Christian community, that this will necessarily do all the things that you might hope that it would do in terms of dealing with the things you can't control. So it's way too simple to just say belonging to community is going to improve your outcomes. That may be statistically true, that people who are completely isolated have worse outcomes from people who belong in communities. But then if you were going to look at the types of communities, you could probably break that down more. And I have no doubt you would find that there are certain types of communities, like white supremacy organizations, neo-Nazi organizations, where mental health outcomes, they might be better in terms of your depression outcome, but maybe not so much in your anger management. You know what I'm saying? So we can't just be simplistic about this. We have to be a little bit more nuanced when we try and say it's just about community. Now, I do want to say this, and this is very important for those of you who have managed to stick it out this far. into my ranting, it is scientifically inescapable that religion, not community, but religion leads to significantly better outcomes for mental health. Now, I don't even really need to source that because I am without any doubt. If you go looking anywhere, you will find innumerable studies that prove this fact that statistically speaking, the more religious, the lesser rates of depression, anxiety, substance abuse disorder, and suicidal behavior that there will be. It doesn't eliminate it, obviously, but it is statistically much less. Even in terms of recovery, we see that schizophrenia does better, and recovery from schizophrenia is better with a religious worldview. So one real simple article, I'll give you a reference here. Rob Whitley, PhD, Psychology Today, posted December 18, 2017. Religion and mental health, what is the link? Okay, now just for some context, he cites 84 different peer-reviewed studies, all of which supporting the statistical advantage to being religious in terms of your mental health outcomes. 84 peer-reviewed studies which support that. All right, good. Now, that tells you that there is a real and measurable outcome to having a religious outlook and belonging to a religious community. Now, he also breaks that down in that article, if you're going to follow it, that there is both measurable advantages to belonging to the religious community, and even for those who are religious that gain advantages from their personal prayer and devotion, and even just watching sermons on the radio or the television or the internet, that people who do that even without the community, they have measurable outcomes as well. And that's really interesting because it is not scientifically demonstrable that depression medication works, for example. Now, before you go all shutting the video off in anger, if you're going to accuse me of being an anti-science loony, we'll address that next time. Okay, this is a book I would strongly recommend to people interested in this. So James Davies is not a kook. He's a Oxford PhD graduate in medical and social anthropology. Okay, he is a practicing clinician himself, and he is just citing evidence and scientific truth. So what's really interesting, he cites in chapter 4, The Depressing Truth About Happy Pills, that in, I think it was 1997. So two blokes, Saperstein and Kirsch, both doctors, decided to do a meta-analysis to evaluate the advantages of depression medication. And having done that meta-analysis, which basically means they just looked at all of the published studies on the statistical advantage of the use of depression medications. Now, here's actually, I'm probably breaking some sort of copyright here, but I don't have enough viewers for it to matter. Have a look at that, see? Okay, so what they found was that with no treatments, you had relatively small percentage of recovery, but there's no, basically you've got around a 0.3% difference between sugar pills and drugs. So just giving people a sugar pill and nothing, telling them it's a drug, is only 0.3% less effective. Well, I shouldn't even say that. Call it around 10% less effective than giving them the actual drug. And if you looked at that, psychotherapy alone is actually more effective than both. Right? That says something. So just talking it out. and helping people learn to cope with it in more of the Jungian fashion proves to be more effective than the drug. Now, what's interesting is it then says that being deeply alarmed by these findings, they followed through and tried to establish more understanding, like there had to be a problem here. And then they discovered that they were only using the published trials and had therefore failed to include the unpublished trials. And so they did an Access to Information Act and found that 40% of the trials on antidepressant drugs had not been published by the pharmaceutical companies that did them. And so they got the right, the legal right to access those, and then they found that they didn't actually work better than placebos hardly at all. Like less than statistical anomaly difference. And so they followed it through a little bit more, and they found that possibly for about 10% less, about 8 to 9% of the population, there appears to be a measurable, although statistically minor, difference between the outcomes of people using drugs versus sugar pills. And then if you cut that 9% out, the remaining 92% has a literally zero difference between sugar pills and depression pills. Okay, so I just want to throw all that out there. That's probably a lot, and a bunch you may have left. Oh well, you're not listening to me right now. Anyway, the point is, it is scientifically unquestionable, based on all of the analysis that's been done, is that religion does improve the outcome both of mental resiliency and of healing from mental injuries, including severe mental handicaps like schizophrenia. Okay, mental disease like schizophrenia. Anyway, we're not on the politically correct channel. So, drugs, statistically no advantage for the majority of people. Religion, statistically unquestionable advantage. And yet, we're quite happy not to pursue religion. We're quite happy to avoid that entirely. So I would challenge you, if you're here and you're actually listening to this, think about that for a second. Why are you unwilling, if you're that guy, to walk through the doors of a church when it is statistically, indisputably proven to have a greater advantage to you than the medications that you're already on, including your weed that you're smoking, which I'm sure does actually help cope with the symptoms of these things. So, I'm not criticizing or questioning that that's true. It will dull the pain, but if we're talking about recovery and better long-term outcome, no advantage, right? So, day-to-day coping, great. You want to actually get better? Come to church, guys. Now, all of that, it matters what kind of church you go to, okay? Because some people here may listen to this and say, but yeah, I did not find that at church. Yeah, well, I believe you. There's a lot of churches which don't express Christian values very well. And arguably, none of us, I mean, it's not even arguable. I'll just state it. No Christian church you ever go to will perfectly reflect Christ's love. I'm sorry. Like, I am a fallen man just like you. I do not have godlike capacity for love and mercy. I nevertheless recognize how deeply in debt to my God I am through Christ, and so I do my best to genuinely share that with others, and it's not. Anyway, point being, should you have gone into a situation where you felt this community is not supportive of me and it's not actually helping me, that may be true. So some things that you need to consider: the advantages of community for coping with a traumatic experience or with stress, with depression, anxiety, or other various mental maladies, you need acceptance, right? So, a church where you're going to express your vulnerable nature and not be loved and accepted, that's a problem. And I expect to degrees that's always a danger in human interaction. So there's a reason why, after the First World War in Canada, we established all of these legions as places guys could go and have a beer with fellow soldiers, and they could then kind of let their hair down and talk about the horrible things they'd done. And, well, frankly, beer's a pretty good motivator to talk about the horrible things you've done, uh, particularly if you have too much of it. And that was a place away from the gentlefolk and the ladies that people could be honest. Well, churches need to do that, and we need to provide places where that can happen. So it's something we certainly have dedicated ourselves to do here. We have our little men's get-togethers and things like that, where you can just kind of say what you need to say and talk about what's going on. And we need to do that. We need to provide an environment to be honest. So that's important. That's a huge aspect of it. But ultimately, that's not the answer of Christianity, right? That's not the answer that this church offers. It's not that those aren't important things. We absolutely need to provide a community where you can share some dark stuff and kind of learn how to cope with it without having to be afraid of being judged. So, go to a pastor and talk. Great. But ultimately, the answer that Christianity offers is that no matter how insufficient your church or other communities are, if you trust in Jesus Christ, that there will be an actual, real, tangible change in your experience, and you will have community with Him. And that community is with one who will never judge you unfit, but that He will always accept you, and that He will always forgive you, and you have a conversation partner who already knows everything you did and will ever do, and that He accepts you for it. That's pretty significant. And you know what? Probably doesn't even matter if, and I sincerely don't believe this, but I'm just challenging you for those of you that are being skeptical here. So you say, yeah, that's nice, but it's lunacy. Like, well, if you're here because you're already suffering with mental anguish and emotional anguish and injury, what exactly are you afraid to lose, man? If I'm delusional and happy and have a friend that I have made up for myself that I can confess all of my deepest, darkest secrets to and feel loved and accepted, well, maybe you should too. But it's not an imagination, it's real. And I encourage you to explore that in a Bible believing church. I beg you to consider going and finding a place where people actually read that book and believe that it's true, not some, church that's all about just, yeah, it's a nice book and God's a nice guy, but a church that actually deals with the God of the Bible as unfriendly and not nice as he often is, and then wants to get to know that guy, that creator. You may find this is the one thing, and the one real community that you will always be able to count on, even eternally. So consider that.